Hello, welcome to this new video tutorial series on Arturia's Jupiter-8V, an emulation of Roland's Jupiter-8 from the early 80s. It was released in 81 and just ruled the waves throughout the 80s. This was Roland's flagship synth, and that basically made it the world's flagship synth. It's completely fantastic. I don't know what they put in their drinks over at Roland, but holy moly, they can make a synth. But we don't get any of that loveliness until we've eaten our veg. This is the sound that we're going to be dealing with for the next few minutes. We're talking about the oscillators today. I'm going to give you an introduction to this section of the synth over here. We have two oscillators, VCO1 and 2, voltage controlled oscillator. Those two oscillators combine into a voice. The synthesizer is capable of generating 32 independent voices, so 64 oscillators in total, but try to think in terms of voices. And by default we have 8. The polyphony value down at the bottom of the synth tells us how many voices are available to us, and in homage to the original instrument, which was 8-note polyphonic, that's where it's set by default. It's also kinder to your CPU than cranking it up all the way. If I temporarily drop that to 2 and play 1, 2, 3 notes, do you hear the low note disappear? That's because we have 2-note polyphony, and the 2 high notes were taking those slots. The oldest note got thrown away. We'll deal with all of that in a later video, but suffice to say for now, we have a simple polyphonic instrument. Each key is generating 2 different sounds. It has 2 separate oscillators. Now, having said that, at the moment, that note that I just played is only using one of them. We've got this source mix knob over here. This controls the mix between the 2 oscillators, and when it's all the way over on the left hand side, we're only hearing VCO1. So what we're hearing and seeing in the oscilloscope down here is a pretty loose interpretation, a Roland interpretation of a sawtooth. All that colour comes from the shape not being quite perfect, so it's great, but that's what it is. We also have a triangle, kind of, a pulse wave, which we call rectangle. So I don't like the term, but there it is, it's a rectangle wave. This is a pulse wave, and that means that we have an on duty cycle and an off duty cycle, and they're represented by straight lines. Now, can you see that it's as wide at the top as it is at the bottom? That means it has a 50% duty cycle. A 50% duty cycle rectangle wave or pulse wave is the same as a square wave. So those two things sound exactly the same. Now, in a later video we'll deal with this in more detail, but just to show you that the rectangle setting is different, I'm just going to change this slider over here, pulse width modulation. I'm going to change the width of the pulse. And that's what that does. Having said that, let's not worry about pulse width modulation for now. We'll deal with that when we come to look at the controls that actually feed into it. We have a range knob. So these values here are a throwback to the old days of church organs. It's the length of the pipe that would make that tone. And basically, every time you halve the size of the pipe, you go up by 1 octave. So nice and simple. Most synths you'll find tend to default at 8 foot. That's the note in the middle of your keyboard is 8 foot. I'll just switch that back to sawtooth wave, and that's it for oscillator 1. It's a really simple oscillator, no frills or fanciness. We're going to come back to it shortly, but just for now, let's hop over to VCO2. which means on our source knob, turning that all the way to the right hand side, and now we're going to hear this. At the moment it sounds exactly the same because both VCOs have a sawtooth option and both oscillators have an 8-foot range option. Now can you see the range knob on the VCO2 is different? The values aren't clustered together. That's because you can increase this one in semitones. And we also have a fine tune knob which gives us a 50% of a semitone in either direction. Now you see I've deliberately set that not quite to 1. If you double click on the knob, any control in an Arturia product, if you double click on that control, it will set it to halfway. That's sometimes not wonderful. This knob over here, for instance, takes you to +6, which we don't particularly want, but there you go. It's a feature of the interface. Let's have a look at the different waves available to us in VCO2. We've got a sine wave, nice and simple. We've got a rectangle wave, just like VCO1, and it's controlled by the same slider. So this pulse width modulation slider controls the width of both oscillators. They're linked and they can't be decoupled. And finally we have a noise generator. So that's it for the basic settings in VCO2. Now let's mix those two things together. I'll set the source, well, I'll double click it, set the source to 50%. I'll set VCO1 to a triangle, VCO2 I'll leave it as a sawtooth. And now that's a combination of those two waves. Okay, much more colourful sound you can see in the oscilloscope. Combining different shape waves together is a really good way of introducing colourful harmonics. We're not done there though, there are more options available to us. Let's have a look at this sync mode. Now sync is dedicated to VCO2. If we turn that on, what's going to happen is that VCO2 is now going to be enslaved by VCO1 basically. Whatever pitch the VCO1 oscillator is set to, that's the pitch you're going to hear out of VCO2, even though it's still responsible for generating its colour of tone, whether it's a sine wave or a sawtooth or whatever, but its pitch is going to be determined by VCO1. And what this means is that those two oscillators are locked together. They're guaranteed to produce the same pitch, and that might be an effect you want, but you also get really interesting harmonic options out of VCO2 that aren't otherwise available to you. If I move the source mix all the way over to the right hand side, so we're only hearing VCO2, switch to a sawtooth wave, it's got the most harmonics, so it's the most interesting sound to hear and the easiest to manipulate in oscilloscopes. Now then, I'm going to change the pitch of VCO2. Everything that you just heard there was a C. The pitch of the sound didn't change. The colour did, and we'll deal with that in a moment, but the pitch didn't. Now I'm going to change the pitch of VCO1, which shouldn't have anything to do with anything, because VCO1 is currently not in the mix. It's not one of the two oscillators we're hearing. So when we change the pitch of VCO1, we hear it manifested in VCO2. Why is that? It's because VCO1 is responsible for re-triggering VCO2. Every time VCO1 gets to the end of its cycle, whatever its wave is doing in the background, however quickly it's oscillating, when it gets to the end of its cycle, it forces VCO2 to restart drawing its wave from the beginning. And the easiest way to demonstrate it is to make VCO2 oscillate slightly faster than VCO1. So VCO2 is drawing the whole of its sawtooth wave plus another little bit of the next sawtooth wave that it wants to generate when VCO1 comes along and slams the band hammer down and says stop. VCO2 kind of does what it's told and goes back to starting to redraw the wave from the beginning again. Again, it gets all the way through drawing one saw, one cycle, one period, and then begins during the second wave when VCO1 comes along and says stop doing that. So what we see is a whole sawtooth plus another little bit of the next saw along when the chop comes. Now if I go all the way up to plus 12, VCO2 is now oscillating twice as fast as VCO1, which means that effectively they are in sync. And so it's able to draw both of its waves before VCO1 comes along and says stop doing that, do something new. It doesn't matter that it's being instructed to do something new because it happens to be at the beginning of the third wave that it was going to draw anyway, so there's no effect. So we don't see any change in the pitch. And then when we carry on past plus 12, then we suddenly break the wave again and we'll get another sync at plus 24 where again it's doubled its frequency. It's now able to draw 4 waves in the space of time it takes VCO1 to draw 1. So sync is really interesting because it generates harmonic possibilities, harmonic shapes that don't occur via any other form of synthesis. That is a difficult wave shape to draw if you don't sync oscillators together. Now this selection down here is currently set to normal. If we set it to low, VCO2 goes into low frequency oscillator mode. It decouples from the keyboard. It's now going to generate a wave determined entirely by its range and fine-tune settings, and it's not enormously useful in its own right. It is kind of useful. If we go into noise mode, we hear a low, booming, deep, rumbling noise kind of thing. But for all of the other settings, let's have a sawtooth. Again, it's audible. It's very, very low. And if we turn this range down low enough, we've basically lost pitch. Now we're just getting that nasty kind of clicking sound. If I switch to a sine tone and then go through the frequency range, depending on how old you are, about there, I couldn't swear to being able to hear that anymore. And now I absolutely can't. So that's gone past the point of human hearing. We can't hear pitches that low. That's not really what LFOs are used for. Low frequency oscillators, they're used primarily as modulation sources elsewhere. Now, the low frequency oscillator mode of VCO2 in this particular synthesizer isn't massively utilised. This slider over here is basically the only place you're going to actually be able to make use of it. So let's talk about this cross setting. What's this doing? This is cross modulation, and what this means is that VCO2 is going to be used to modulate the pitch of VCO1. It's a pitch controlled modulation. So if I set this as low as I possibly can, all the way down at 16 foot in low frequency oscillator mode, it's still actually cycling quite quickly. So I've turned my oscilloscope as low as it will go to 21.5 Hertz, and you can see it's drawing about 2/5 of the wave, so it's somewhere in the region of 10 Hertz ish. Now that 10 Hertz wave is going to be used to modulate the pitch of VCO1. So let's switch over to VCO1, so that's the only oscillator we can hear. Basically, the number of waves that you can see in that oscilloscope tells you whether or not the pitch is going up or down. The more waves you can see, the higher the pitch, the higher the frequency. When you see that kind of shimmying thing side to side, don't be deceived. That's not actually the speed of the oscillation. That's like a strobing effect. This is now oscillating. Can't actually see it oscillating that quickly, and if I increase the range of this VCO2, then the effect will get more and more dramatic very quickly. So in low frequency mode, it's a low frequency oscillator operating on the pitch of VCO1. We can, however, leave VCO2 in normal mode, so now it's cycling at audible pitches. VCO2 is currently oscillating at middle C, 261 Hertz. So there's absolutely no way you're going to be able to hear each of those individual oscillations. It's going to manifest as kind of, frankly, a pretty nasty sound. Go back over to VCO1. This is the sound we want to hear. It's going to be modulated by VCO2, and this is what we get. You've got two completely different effect options available to you with this cross modulation, depending on whether or not VCO2 is in low mode or normal mode. Don't confuse cross modulation with ring modulation, by the way. I used to think they were the same thing. I was actually mistaken. They're not. Cross modulation is all about frequency modulation. Ring modulation is an amplitude modulation effect. We'll deal with that another time. It's a conversation for another time, but they're not the same. They sound similar. They manifest with additional harmonics on either side of the fundamental, but they are actually different effects. So that's the oscillators covered. In the next episode, we'll deal with the envelopes and see how they're implemented on the Jupiter. Hope to see you then. Thanks very much for watching.